This is the Grimm brothers' version of Snow White. Once upon a time there was a beautiful queen who longed for a child. As she sat one winter's morn staring out the black ebony frame of her window, she accidentally pricked her finger on her sewing needle. The queen stretched her arm forth, allowing the drops of blood to gently spatter on the snow below, and she thought to herself, "I would long for a child as white as the snow, as red as my blood, and as black as ebony." Soon after that the queen had a beautiful child who was white as snow, red as blood, and hair that was black as ebony. But when the child was born, the queen died. A year later the king took a new wife, who was very beautiful, but too proud to have anyone else surpass her in beauty. The queen had a wonderful looking-glass, and she would stand in front of it looking at herself, and say, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The looking-glass answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all."
Snow White was growing to be very beautiful, and when she was 7 years old the queen asked the looking-glass who was the most beautiful in the land, and the looking-glass said, "Snow White." The queen became jealous, so she asked a hunter to have her killed. The hunter took Snow White to the forest and was about to pierce her with his knife when she began to cry. Snow White was so beautiful that the hunter took pity on her and told her never to return home. The hunter killed an elk as it passed, and took the lungs and liver to the queen, and she had them prepared with salt and ate them. Snow White was running through the forest and came along a little cottage, so she went inside. The cottage was small, and there were 7 little plates, 7 little forks, 7 little knives, and 7 little mugs. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from a plate, and drank wine from a mug. Then she lay down in a little bed because she was so exhausted.
When it was dark, the owners of the cottage came home and saw that someone had been there. They found Snow White sleeping in the bed and thought she seemed like a lovely child. They asked her her name, and she told them, "Snow White." She told the dwarfs her story, and one of the dwarfs said, "If you will take care of our home and cook for us, you can stay here for nothing." And so kindly the dwarfs made Snow White welcome in their home, and she lived there peacefully and content for many years. Snow White's jealous stepmom was not living peacefully and content, however, because she knew that Snow White was still alive and still more beautiful than she. Therefore the stepmom dressed up as an ugly old woman and made 3 attempts on Snow White's life. First, she bound her with lace, causing her to be unable to breathe. Second, she poisoned a comb that caused Snow White to lose consciousness. Third, she poisoned 1/2 of an apple. Snow White apparently does not learn from previous lessons, because again she trusted the ugly old lady. She bit the apple and succumbed to the poison.
The poor dwarves were so grief-stricken that they could not part with their beautiful Snow White, so they built her a gorgeous glass coffin and placed her within. There she lay until a handsome prince sought shelter at the dwarf's cottage. Falling desperately in love with her, Snow White, he pleaded with the dwarves to allow him to take Snow White with him back to his castle because he couldn't bear to not ever look at her again. He loved her so. The dwarves conceded, and on the trip back to the castle, the prince dropped the coffin. This slight jumble was all that was needed to dislodge the poison apple. Snow White awoke and fell madly in love with the prince, of course. They lived happily ever after, and oh yeah, the stepmom didn't. At Snow White's wedding, they made her dance until she died, which she did. The end.